This webinar is organized by the Finance and Biodiversity Community, which is part of the European Business and Biodiversity Platform. And we're organizing this together with the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation, which is also coordinating the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge. And before I'll explain a bit more on that, I'll hand over to my colleague Janne for a few housekeeping rules.
Hi everyone, welcome. So just a few notes to make sure everything runs smoothly today. I would just like to ask you to keep your microphones muted and your cameras off. Not that we don't want to see you, but just to avoid any technical disruptions. There will be enough time for Q&A after the presentations, so make sure to submit your questions at any time in the chat box, which you can find on your right-hand side. Please put your name, the name of the speaker and your question, and our moderators will address it later on. The session, as you know, is being recorded, and we will share both the recording and the slides with you all afterwards, and it will also be made available on our website. If you're not hearing us well or seeing us well, could I please ask you to just open a new window using Google Chrome or Edge and copy pasting the link. If you're still having any issues, just post something in the chat, or you can always email me. Enjoy the webinar.
Thanks a lot, Janne. So, yeah, we're very happy with the lineup of speakers. So this webinar is organized by the European Business and Biodiversity Platform, which is a sharing platform set up by the European Commission to provide businesses a space for sharing experiences. And since 2017, there's a finance community active under this Business and Biodiversity Platform. This finance community is still growing and has also initiated the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge, which is now also organized under an independent foundation, the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation. Together with the members, we've been preparing the program for today. So it's really a bottom-up, demand-driven way of sharing practices and also building knowledge together doing so. This is an important webinar in time. This is this year the CBD negotiations will be starting, and we're very happy to also have Basil van Haveren in the room, who's involved as a co-chair with the open-ended working group to the Convention on Biological Diversity, and who's leading together with his colleague on the Global Biodiversity Framework that will be negotiated in April and May 2022. But next to that, we're also having speakers from DG FISMA. European Commission is very, front-running when it comes to regulation and sustainability, and is now working on a regulation for corporate social responsibility and reporting on this. This regulation is in the making, so we thought it would be good to combine those two in this webinar and have really the speakers that are working on this, sharing this with you. We also looked into inviting speakers from the Sustainable Finance Regulation, but we did not manage to find someone available for this at the moment. So we'll focus in this webinar on the developments within the CBD and the negotiations, the Global Biodiversity Framework, and also this corporate social responsibility reporting. In the end, actually, this all should come together somewhere in 2022, alignment of this kind of regulation, alignment of a global agreement on biodiversity. So we hope this webinar can inform you on this stepping point in time, and maybe also can contribute with the discussions that we may have in this. I'd like to hand over to Sona Littman, who's one of the active members in this, interim chair of the working group Public Policy Advocacy within the foundation, and to provide a little bit perspective from the finance sector insight on the topic. Over to you, Sonia.
Thank you very much, Anna-Marie, and hello everyone. It's great to be with you today. I think that the first message is that there's a lot of positive momentum within the financial sector on understanding how significant the loss of biodiversity is to us as an industry and to society as a whole. And there's also a growing recognition about how the sector has to be a part of the solution. We can see this just by the growing number of signatories to the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge, which reached 75 last week. So that's brilliant news. I think there's also a growing understanding that we can't really solve climate change without also addressing the nature crises. So a growing understanding of how interconnected these two are. And obviously, what's key, a really important part of the puzzle for the financial sector to address biodiversity loss is to have an effective regulatory environment. So to have policies in place that enable action on biodiversity, that support positive developments. And so I'm really pleased to be here today and really looking forward to hearing from the speakers about both what's happening on a global level and what's happening at the European level.
Thank you, Sonia. And next to the speakers that I already introduced to you, I'm also very happy to have Patrick de Cambour in the room, who will be speaking on behalf of EFRAG related to the CSRD, and also Guido Broekhoven, who's head of policy research at WWF and will provide some reflections in this space. So I'd like to hand over to my colleague Anita de Horde, who will be facilitating and moderating the first block of this webinar, Policy Developments within the Convention on Biological Diversity. Over to you, Anita.
Great. Thank you, Anne-Marie. Great that you're all here. This block, the title of this webinar is a little misleading. It's not only on regulation, but also on policy. And that is this block, first block, is all about. We have three speakers. The first one is Basil van Havre. He is the co-chair of the open-ended working group of the Convention of Biological Diversity. He will tell us all about the process of creating a global biodiversity framework. Then we have some views by WWF, Guido Broekhoven. He is head of policy research of WWF International. So he will give some insights on the negotiations and a perspective from an NGO side. And then we end with some views of Sona Littman. We just heard her, she is the chair, the interim chair of the working group Public Policy Advocacy of the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge. Up to you. Would like to give the word to Basil first. And we first hear the speakers, and in the end we have time to answer all your questions. So up to you, Basil van Havre.
Thank you very much. And let me first say how pleased I am to be part of this event. What I've noticed over the last few months is how fast the finance community can move. Probably not something you hear very often. And move in a good direction, where I think at some point you're pulling us more than us trying to pull you. So my name is Basil van Havre. I'm a co-chair with a colleague from Uganda, Francis Ogwal, of the Global Biodiversity Framework negotiation. So what that means is that Francis and I are trying to coordinate the negotiation of the 194 parties. And we're very lucky to have this opportunity to do that. So I've prepared a presentation with 14 slides, 15 minutes. So I will probably go very fast over that presentation and try to give you the input you need, and probably leave a lot of questions unanswered. Apologies in advance for that. So slide 1 is directly taken from the report of the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service. That's their global assessment report. And what they have identified is what is in the little box at the bottom, the drivers of biodiversity loss: land and sea use change, overexploitation, climate change, pollution, invasive species. The rest of the slide you don't need to worry about. There is a bit of a different application depending on landscape. There is a number of indirect drivers that you should be worrying about a little bit, but we will get into that. Next slide. Now, this page is, again, not coming from us. We're pretty good at copying stuff that got me through university. And that's taken from a briefing created by Business for Biodiversity for CEOs. So it is, and I found it was very interesting to give that to you because this is not coming from the community, this is coming from business, and that is directed at senior level executive. And then basically you see how food, land use, ocean use, and we want to move from a negative framework to a positive one. The second perspective is infrastructure and built environment, and how we can turn that from something that is negative to a positive one. And then the third perspective is on energy and extractive, and how large-scale exploitation can be moved to something positive. So the future we're trying to describe is one that we hope will be better. The challenge is the arrow in the middle. How do we get from the current situation to the next one, and how do we finance that? World Economic Forum estimate that around half of the GDP is depending on nature, so therefore we need to be mindful of that. Yes, you can go to the next one. So here on this slide, I've talked about the urgency to act and the rationale for doing that. In kind of teal in the middle, as a bunch of principle that was given to us by the Conference of the Parties back in late 2018. This is going to be a party-led process, so that's why Francis and I were asked to lead that. It's going to be a participatory and inclusive process, which is important because inclusive and participatory means that you have a place in that process. Transformative, comprehensive, catalytic, visible, etc., etc. What we've been asked by the community to do is to create a set of realistic yet ambitious targets. So on one hand, they need to tackle the challenge identified by the scientists, but they need to be realistic in terms we got to have a good idea on how we make that happen. They cannot be aspirational. Also, a very clear desire for a robust reporting and review mechanism, which is a departure from previous frameworks. We're going to see that. And this needs to be far-reaching in terms of a framework for all. And you will see yourself in terms of the finance and business. And what we're trying to do, not saying that we've been successful so far, is to write it in a generic enough language that everybody can read it and recognize themselves into that, and build an open performance framework that can align and integrate with others. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Next slide, please. A few words on the convention. One of the three Rio Convention, together with climate, that you hear a lot about, desertification, perhaps a little bit less. Three objectives to this convention. Conservation, obviously, is something you all understand and know. What you probably perhaps as less familiar is how the two other objectives, which is about how nature meet people need. Food, shelter, protection. And we're going back to that half of the economy, depending on nature. And then finally, the equitable sharing of benefits. So we work on package of 10-year targets and goals. So we're now working on the 2020 to 2031, and we rely on implementation at the national, subnational level and through other conventions. So we're setting goals. We're not necessarily the one implementing those goals. Chemical conventions may do their bit. The Convention on International Trades may do their bit, etc., etc. Next slide. Where we are. So we have this group, and I think I've talked about all that. We're supported by Secretariat. I'd rather go to the next slide, which is kind of a flow chart of where we are. So you see that we've made quite a bit of ways, and I don't expect you to read all the little box. Depending on the size of the screen, I can see some of you already cringing. But the point is that we've been through long consultation at the regional level and on some of the thematic issues. And we've produced draft 0 in early 2020. We've produced draft 1, which is a major update in July of this year. We've conducted some online meeting in August, and we're now getting ready for the face-to-face negotiation that will take place in January over a period of 3 weeks. So that's an important point for us. There is an opportunity for you to engage both as an industry at the global level, but also at the national level in making your views known. And if we're successful, we'll deal with a large part, if not all, of the issues in Geneva in January. But there may be some that are remaining, and there will be a final set of negotiation at the COP in the end of April, early May, with the hope that we can finalize everything at this time. So if we can go to the next slide. On the left here, you see, you may not worry about that, but the draft 1 is a full draft. We have provided numerical aspects in every instance where it's needed. It is supported by the science advice we've received. And on the left, you get this kind of flower, poorly designed flower-like graphic, which meant that at the core of the system, there is the commitment that will be agreed to by government. But around that, there is room for the others. There is voluntary commitment by business, by governments, subnational governments, by the financial sector. So I was very, very pleased to see the commitment last week at the UNGA, which is right in the kind of approach we're looking for. Next slide, please. So typical, what we call theory of change in UN language, which is kind of a flow diagram for everybody else, going from a left to right to current status that is with some challenge in terms of loss of biodiversity. We want to get to that vision. And basically what is important is the terminology and the structure in the middle. The vision, living in harmony with nature, is great. Everybody agree with it. But how do you measure that? And that's why we're proposing to have milestones and goals that are measurable attribute of that vision. And how do we get to those milestones is through actions. And you will see in the next slide how we group actions around reducing the threats, meeting people needs, tools and solutions, all that within the context of implementation enabling condition. So let's go to the next slide. And that's a bit of an animation starting from the center where you get the living in harmony with nature. We decompose that into 4 goals. Those goals are meant to be at the 2050 level, and you further decompose that in milestones at the 2030 level. And here come the actions. And we'll talk about some of those actions in a minute, but you see that there is from target 1 to target 13 action on the various drivers of biodiversity loss. Land is target 1 to 3, and then harvest 5, invasive 6, etc., etc. But and then one message we want to leave with you. You may be hearing a lot about 30 by 30, which is around the protection and conservation of land, but it is one aspect of one threat. We have to look at the certain actions addressing all the threats. That's a package. Addressing pollution, addressing invasive alien species is also part of the equation. And in order to realize that, we need means and tools and solution, and that's what is between the action of 14 and 21, and all that in the context of enabling condition. I think if we can click through the last layer, you can see it. So that gives you a general context of the totality of what we're doing. Let's delve quickly down to the level that is relevant to you. And a number of aspects are extremely important, and I've chosen some of the language and I try to highlight some of the aspects. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion because you may want different wording, you may want to have different interest, and really interested into that. So starting from a goal D, which is about closing the financial gaps in terms of implementing the vision, and I will talk to that a little bit more in detail on the next slide, and that is further decomposed in financial and non-financial resources. as well as ensuring that we continue to identify the resource and continue to close that gap. Now, looking at the targets, target 14 and 15 are related. There is a target 16 that is more directed toward individual citizen that may not be directly relevant to you, but I felt that 14 is particularly relevant as it talks about ensuring that all activities and financial flows are aligned with biodiversity values. Now, I'm sure you'll have good advice on how to make that more permanent, but I wanted to let you know that we're sensitized to that. 15 is more related to business, and there is that notion of reporting and assessing both the dependencies and the impact, and that's where we're getting into disclosure requirements. And that's allowing me to illustrate a little bit how we can set some goals in the targets, but it is going to be implemented through sectoral initiative at the global level and national and local initiative in terms of, for example, disclosure requirements, etc. Target 18 and 19, one is about the reforming or eliminating a negative incentive and harmful incentive. And target 19 is increasing the level of of investment, leveraging private finance. So we're trying to do a big leap. I'm sure for you it's easy, it's common sense, but the biodiversity community is used to be supported by government money. And moving from this kind of single dimension world to a multi-dimensional world where private sector, private finance money is important, is requiring a little bit of education, and we're trying to do our best to do that. But I just wanted to let you know that we're working through that. So that's a very, very quick run through the targets. I wanted to explain something about the closing that financial gap. Very classical graphic with a timeline on the axis and then up the cost and the availability of funding. And what we think we want is to close the gap by 2050. We can go some ways in 2030, but probably not all the way. And then one of the key tools will be that decreasing costs, so eliminating the negative incentive. Obviously, we need to bring the number up from what is currently 140 billion to 150 billion to 200, of which we would like to see an increase of 10 billion going to developing countries, which all those sounds like big numbers. They're all based on financial studies like the Waldron, Paulson, and Dasgupta review. At this point in time, I'm keeping a little tally of all the various commitments. I think we're around $2.5 billion going to developing countries, so a quarter of the way to what we want to do. So even if we all feel a little bit scared by the magnitude of those numbers, we have to grasp with them because they are the reality and they're doable. So moving to the next slide, which is the final thoughts. We have a lot of elements that are appearing, and I think your community should be saluted for leadership and knocking on our door and forcing us to change. And I would encourage you to continue to do that. What we see is that the awareness and engagement and level of sophistication vary greatly among countries. That's what we need is to see your industry continuing on the way of making voluntary commitments and to raise ambition and continue to tell us how you want us to move. We will be successful if we are all pushing in the same direction, and we basically depend on your efforts to be successful. And finally, I think those of our, if I call it our ecosystem, our social ecosystem that will be moving early, will be the one that will stand to gain immensely. So. Last slide, I choose to put on the last slide a very small economic activities. That's a fish processing plant in the northern British Columbia part, but I found it was a good symbol how things could be evolving. Thank you very much. I hope I was not too long, and I'm happy to listen to the rest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Please keep your questions you have in mind. You can already put them in the chats for later. So at the end of this block, we can answer. We can see if we have time to answer it. And then I would like to give the floor to Guido. Guido Broekhoven, Head of Policy Research of WWF.
Thank you very much. Can I share my screen? Can you see it now?
It's starting. Yes, we can.
Yes, great. Well, thanks for inviting me to speak at this update webinar. WWF does a lot of advocacy work around the Global Biodiversity Framework. We also work a lot with the finance sector. So it's great to see those two coming together, and it's great to be part of that process. I'd like to start, before diving into sort of the nitty-gritty of the framework, I'd like to start by taking the cue from Sonia and reminding us of this connection between climate and biodiversity. And that was also reiterated at a recent IPBES and IPCC report. IPBES, the preeminent scientific body on biodiversity, and IPCC for climate change. And really they came together a few months ago and produced a report where they reiterated again this interdependence between the climate crisis and the nature crisis, and that you won't be able to address the climate crisis without addressing the biodiversity loss and degradation, and that you really need sort of an integrated policy framework to do so effectively. The reason why I want to come back to that is because this indicates that we need a Peristyle agreement for nature. And in order to get there, what you need is sort of high-level political commitment at the highest level, really. And you also need a growing movement, growing momentum from all types of stakeholders to undertake action, to make commitments, and to demand action by governments. And we're seeing in the nature sphere, we're seeing some very encouraging signs happening there through the Leaders' Pledge for Nature. On the government side, commitments of EU funding for biodiversity, and on the private sector side, also through Business for Nature, the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge, and some other signs, and also from other sectors of society. For example, a broad range of non-state actors, about 100 altogether, from all different sectors of society, development, faith groups, private sector, humanitarian organizations, and indeed conservation organizations, coming together 2 weeks ago, issuing a call for action by governments to agree on a nature positive and ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So these are positive signs. Now, how would a Peristyle agreement look like according to WWF? We actually formulated our own proposals for that framework a few months ago in what we call the Kunming Plan for Nature and People. And for us, it is really important that framework can make a step difference, we think, a step change in 5 key areas. And that comes in addition to increased area-based and species conservation. We think there's these 5 elements that are really important to make that step change. One is that it needs to clearly indicate where we want to be by 2030 through the formulation and adoption of a mission to reverse nature loss and to have a nature positive world by the end of this decade. Underneath that mission, you would need to have a series of outcomes that sort of further define how you get to that mission. And a key outcome, I think, for this discussion is related to reducing our footprint of our production and consumption. And we think that by 2030, we should be halving that footprint of our production and consumption. And that needs to be then underpinned by a series of action targets. We need to have very strong implementation. A previous set of globally agreed targets for biodiversity conservation, the Aichi targets, were not achieved. Implementation was not strong enough. So we really need to have mechanisms in place to enhance implementation of the agreed goals, milestones and targets. We need to have a comprehensive finance and resource mobilization strategy that looks at all sources of finance, both to increase finance for biodiversity and to decrease investments and incentives that are negative to biodiversity. And it all needs to be based on a rights-based approach. Throughout all of that, I think nature-based solutions need to be reflected in the framework as well in an appropriate way to make the connection with climate. Now, what does that mean for sort of the productive and finance sectors? Again, I think it is important that there is that North Star, that commonly agreed goal where we want to be by 2030. And for us, I think being in a nature positive situation through a mission statement for 2030 is the starting point for the framework and to guide productive and financial sectors. And then underneath that, indeed, a series of milestones which define the outcome by 2030. And in the context of the discussions today, this milestone to halve our footprint is incredibly important. This graph comes from the same WEF report and indeed indicates what are the main sectors and actors driving biodiversity loss and nature loss. They relate to food, land and ocean use, infrastructure and built environment, and energy and extractives. So underneath that outcome of halving our footprint, we need to have a series of action-oriented and measurable targets. They need to very clearly articulate what are the actions that governments in particular can undertake. And they need to identify these key sectors that need to be transformed towards nature positive activities. And these sectors, according to us, are particularly agriculture, food systems, forestry and fisheries, infrastructure, extractive industries, and indeed the finance sector that facilitates some of these activities. In addition to that, we need to address a series of cross-cutting issues on circular economy, pollution reduction and nature-based solutions that cut across the different sectors. Now, we need to acknowledge also that there are processes going on outside this global biodiversity framework, and we need to support and align with these other relevant processes. Now, we've been asked to talk a bit about and focus on targets 14 and 15, which speak directly to productive and finance sectors. We welcome the target on mainstreaming, number 14, and the inclusion of financial flows. We think that there is scope to strengthen the action orientation of that target. And in particular, we think it's important that action plans at various levels for these different sectors that drive biodiversity loss, that require transformative change, are useful tools to facilitate that transformation. In terms of the alignment of financial flows, we actually think that it would warrant a separate target. It's important enough to do so, but in any case, it's good that it's mentioned in target 14, and I think in addition it is important that the text referring to aligning financial flows, that it refers to public and private finance, makes it very clear that it is addressing both, and that it aligns these financial flows with that nature positive mission statement for 2030, and that it identifies again some government actions that can facilitate that transition of the finance sector. Similarly then for target 15, we welcome the target that focuses on business. We do feel that the level of ambition of that target needs to match that outcome of halving the footprint and needs to match the ambition of being nature positive by 2030, which means that all negative impacts should be avoided, all businesses need to be nature positive, and that the footprint of all businesses should be addressed beyond only looking at the negative impact. And again, there, I think the role of a government in facilitating that process could be maybe better articulated through the adoption of regulatory measures, etc. So In terms of transforming these key sectors in the global biodiversity, in summary, we believe that these elements reflected in targets 14 and 15 and welcome, and there's scope to make them a bit more comprehensive and ambitious to achieve that nature positive world. These are not the only elements that are relevant, we think, for these productive sectors and for the finance sector. Indeed, the mission would need to guide all actions towards nature positivity, a milestone on the footprint, and other targets are also relevant to productive sectors. For example, the targets on agriculture, on ecosystem use, spatial planning, on consumption as well. They all impact on businesses and the economy. And we've identified a number of important gaps in the framework as well as it stands now. Food systems, a key driver of biodiversity loss, is not explicitly addressed. Neither is infrastructure and fisheries. Infrastructure and food systems were both identified by WEF and others as important drivers. Again, resource mobilization, as Basil was saying, is an important aspect of that whole framework of addressing the drivers and the key sectors. If you continue to invest in harmful incentives, then of course you undermine your positive transformation towards nature positive investments. And the implementation mechanism, if you agree on targets but they're not implemented, then you won't be able to achieve your outcomes and your mission statement. In addition, I think the narrative is really important. We need to make sure that the transformations are just, and we need to point out that they have great potential to generate benefits and opportunities, not only to reducing the finance gap, benefits for health, jobs, reduce land use, and also more resources for government. So in conclusion, we need a nature movement that's sort of similar to a climate movement. And for the finance sector, protecting stability in nature is necessary to protect the stability in the finance system. And we would therefore encourage the finance sector to indeed make these joint commitments and undertake action also, and also to engage with parties to encourage them to adopt an ambitious post-2020 framework that provide a level playing field, that provide clear guidance to where we want to be by 2030 and how we can get there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Guido. Thank you very much. One last short remark by Sonia to sum this block up, and then we have hopefully time for one or two main questions. We're a little running out of time, but we'll see how we can manage. Sonia, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Anita. So within the Public Policy Advocacy Working Group, we've been focused this year on how we can influence the global biodiversity framework. As has already been mentioned, it's a really critical development in how we can act as a world society on this. So I think there's very strong appetite from the financial sector to have a framework that everybody understands and that everybody can work towards implementing effectively, very much like we're doing for the Paris Agreement. I think Basil has already outlined this. You know, everybody needs to be on board and to work towards the same thing. And the second point is that there's strong appetite for the framework to be ambitious. You know, there's increasing recognition of how severe the situation is at the moment, and therefore the global biodiversity framework needs to be sufficiently ambitious to match that the sort of nature crisis that we're facing. And I think an important premise is that the financial sector has to be a part of the solution in order for the global biodiversity framework to be successful. And that's one reason why we've been pushing for the financial sector to be explicitly mentioned. And, you know, in the previous set of targets, the Aichi targets, there was quite limited involvement from the private sector and the financial sector. And I think it's excellent news that that is really changing for this time round. And there are many examples of how the financial sector is getting more involved. Just one is to say that the CBD Secretariat held a workshop for the financial sector in June of this year, where there was lots of lively debate and discussion and interest from the financial sector about how they can contribute and how they can be a part of delivering this framework. And I just wanted to share with you 2 ways in which the advocacy working group and we as Federated Hermes have been trying to influence the global biodiversity framework. So the first is that the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation became an observer to the Convention on Biological Diversity earlier this year. Now that allows the foundation to contribute to negotiations where relevant and to attend meetings of the parties. So I was very pleased to have the opportunity to contribute to the open-ended working group in August on behalf of the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation. And the specific things that we asked for in Target 14, which has already been mentioned today, is to make the reference to public and private financial flows, very much aligned to what Guido outlined, and to create an enabling regulatory environment for the private and financial sectors to address biodiversity-related risks and opportunities. And I'm very pleased to say that our proposal was supported by the EU on behalf of its member states and by the Swiss delegation. So we are clearly aligning with some of the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the second development is that we developed a written statement, a financial institution statement ahead of COP15. This was done in partnership with Ceres, and it was published last week with great success so far, I think. There were 78 signatories from across the world, representing over 10 trillion of US dollars in assets under management, all encouraging governments to increase ambition and with 4 specific asks of parties. So there's still an opportunity to sign on to that statement if you're interested. We're keeping that open all the way until COP15. And we're continuing to look for other ways that we can engage with national governments and to continue to contribute at the global level as well. Thank you very much. Back to you, Anita.
Thank you, Sonja. Thank you very much. I see there are a few questions. We cannot answer them all. Let me start with the first question by David Ruddock. He has a question for Basil on Havre. Let me read it out loud. Given the interdependence between the climate and the biodiversity crisis, how much does a successful CBD COP15 depend on the outcome of COP26? Can you maybe explain a little bit about the interconnection between biodiversity, nature, and COP15 coming up?
So basically, we're codependent on each other. There is one of the key drivers of biodiversity loss is climate change, and we know on the other side that 30 to 37% of the mitigation can come from nature. So it's two-way, and really, when we come down to solution and to actual action taking place on the ground, it's very hard to find projects that do not have dual benefits. So you may be protecting landscape, and that landscape may be sequestering carbons. So that's why in Target 9, we have very explicit language proposal in terms of mitigation, and also a request to the Climate Change Convention to include language about being nature neutral or positive. So we need to work together. I know that it's difficult, and I know that sometimes the communities are not totally aligned, but requests from national governments and from the people implementing the program, the programs will push us to more coordination and integration. We'll keep the top level objective needs to be separate, that's no question, but the plumbing in between and the way we do financing projects and report will need to be integrated.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have one more question myself. Could you tell a little shortly on how the process will look like? Because we now have a draft of the Global Biodiversity Framework. When will there be a second draft, and when there will be negotiations again on this new draft?
Yeah, so we published a draft in July. we're going to get to negotiation in January. We're not preparing a draft per se this fall. What we're going to be preparing is a reflection document that will be a bit of a summary of what we heard in August. So there may be two perspectives on a certain aspect, or there may be how we can, if we can find some helpful language in some cases, we will do so. So look, it's a significant piece of work for Francis and I and our team, but we don't want to publish a draft because there was no negotiation per se. What we expect is that following the Geneva meeting in January, that will be the time for publication of, if we're successful, a final package. If not, a new draft that will go into further negotiation in later and at the COP.
Clear. Thank you very much. There are more questions, and what we try to do is give you written answers. We hope we can achieve this in person and answer all your questions, but not in this webinar because we have to go to the second stage on regulation. Thank you very much for the speakers. Really interesting to learn all on your views. Give the floor now back to Anne-Marie.
Yes, thanks a lot. Brilliant start of the webinar, deep diving into the global biodiversity framework and calling for a high ambition. We'll now have some more attention for the regulatory part at the European level. So we'll do this with 3 speakers. We'll first have Jean-Christophe Niçoise de Chateau from DG FISMA. And then we have Patrick de Cambour on behalf of EFRAG, board member of EFRAG. And we'll also have in the room Lyudmila Strakodanskaya, who's leading the Impact Assessment Working Group within the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation, and also is very active in the Finance and Biodiversity Community. And she will reflect in the end based on a data inventory she has been doing with a subgroup within the working group. But first, I'll hand over to Jean-Christophe for an update on the CSRD. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to be here with you today. I will take you through the scope and main objectives of the Commission's proposal for the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD. Next slide, please. So in 2014, the EU agreed the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, or NFRD, which requires certain companies, so-called public interest entities, meaning listed companies, banks, and insurance companies, to report information regarding the environment, social and employee issues, human rights, bribery and corruption on an annual basis. In 2017, the Commission published non-binding guidelines to help companies report relevant, useful, and comparable information. In June 2019, the Commission further published additional guidelines on how to report climate-related information, which integrate to the recommendation from the TCFD. The NFRD does not specify in any significant detail the information that companies should disclose, and it does not require companies to use any non-financial reporting standard. The accompanying guidelines are non-binding, and with the exception of the climate reporting guidelines, they do not provide detailed guidance to companies. Companies therefore have considerable discretion in deciding what information to report and in the application of the materiality principle. This helps to explain why there are problems with the comparability of information and why many companies do not disclose all information that users think is actually relevant. Next slide, please. The CSRD proposal adopted in April 2021, can we have the next slide? Is key to address these shortcomings. The objective is to strengthen the sustainability reporting rules for non-financial corporates according with information needs of market participants and other stakeholders. We need a consistent flow of sustainability data all the way from companies to asset managers and analysts to investors. Ultimately, this is about empowering investors to make the right decisions and ensuring that what they ask for in terms of green is in fact delivered. I'm just not sure about the slides. Sorry, I'm still on the need for new rules. Is it possible to have the next slide? Or it's just on my screen? I think Joanna has left, no?
It looks like it's...
I'm back. I had some technical issues apparently. I'll reshare the slides, sorry.
No problem. Let me know, yeah.
I'm on the one with the bubbles. So mandatory EU sustainability reporting standards are the most important element of the CSRD proposal. Let me first, however, mention other important elements of that proposal, such as the introduction of a wider scope, special treatment for SMEs, audit, and digitalization. On the scope, the proposal would extend mandatory reporting requirements to some 50,000 companies from about 11,000 today. Essentially, all large companies established in the EU and all listed companies in EU regulated markets. We have focused the proposal on those companies from whose investors and others most need information. There is a special regime for listed SMEs. Next slide, please. Simpler standards and okay, perfect. Simple standard and 3-year phase-in for the requirement. The proposal does not impose any new reporting requirements on the vast majority of SMEs, so the non-listed SMEs. However, there will be a development of simple, proportionate reporting standards for those SMEs to use on a voluntary basis. These standards will help SMEs to respond to demand from sustainability information from banks and from large companies that they supply. They should set a reference for the level of information that banks and large companies can reasonably expect from SMEs. The reporting standards will help SMEs to be part of the transition to a sustainable economy. Next slide, please. The proposal will also introduce for the first time in Europe a requirement for the audit of sustainability information. The absence of an assurance requirement on sustainability reporting threatens the credibility of the sustainability information which is disclosed. The objective here is to have a similar level of assurance for financial and sustainability reporting, so-called reasonable assurance. However, a progressive approach is desirable in order to allow for the development of the assurance markets for sustainability information and for the development of undertakings reporting practices. A gradual approach would also phase in the cost for those undertakings. Therefore, the proposal requires the statutory auditor to carry out a limited assurance engagements on sustainability reporting at the first stage. Given the potential risk of further concentration of the audit market, the proposal allows member states as an option to accredit independent assurance services providers to give the opinion on sustainability reporting. Next slide, please. The proposal further anticipates the increasing digitalization of sustainability information. It requires companies to tag information to make it machine readable. This sustainability information can feed into the future European single access point, which will be proposed by the Commission at the end of this year. Next slide, please. Now, coming back to the central piece, the introduction of mandatory EU sustainability reporting standards. So the development of the standards should provide a rational and cost-effective solution for reporting companies. The current situation of multiple standards and expectations is indeed costly and confusing. EU standards must be coherent with the EU political ambition and with our existing framework for sustainable finance. That has implications for the coverage of sustainability issues, but also for materiality perspectives. It means that from the beginning, EU standards will cover all ESG topics, including but not limited to climate. The CSRD proposal refers that it should be ensured that the information reported by undertakings in accordance with the sustainability reporting standards meets the needs of users. The reporting standards should therefore specify the information that undertakings are to disclose on all environmental factors, including their impacts on dependencies on climate, air, land, water, and of course, biodiversity. In addition, as I already indicated before, the EU standards must be designed integrated both materiality perspectives. They need to cover not just the risk to companies, but also the impact of companies on society and on the environment. So that's the so-called double materiality principle. We believe that this increasingly corresponds to the information that financial markets want and actually need. The draft standards will be developed by the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, or EFRAG. The Commission would then adopt the standards as delegated acts after having consulted with the appropriate EU bodies, including, for example, ESMA. Commissioner McGuinness invited in May 2021 EFRAG to begin the technical development of standards in parallel to the negotiation of the CSRD proposal, which is ongoing. Patrick de Cambourg, chair of the project task force, is here with us today and will be best placed to talk about all of this work. Next slide, please. Next slide again. Yeah, finally, let me finish with the timeline in terms of the legislative proposal and again on the adoption of the standards. So we aim for the conclusion of the legislative process and the negotiations in the first or second quarter of 2022. We envisage the adoption of the first set of standards in October 2022. The earliest that the new requirements could be in place would be for the financial year 2023. So for the reports published in 2024. Final words, the timetable is certainly very ambitious, but this is by initiating work of the development of the draft sustainability reporting standards in parallel to the negotiations and building on the work of EFRAG and especially the task force report published in March that we believe it is feasible. Thank you again. Very much happy to take any question later.
Thank you very much, Jean-Christophe. We'll first deep dive into the standards development by Patrick de Cambourg and then use time for questions. Thank you very much for this introduction and clarifying also the process of DG FISMA. You already mentioned to have handed over the process of standard setting and asked EFRAG to work on this. So we're very happy also to have Patrick de Cambourg in the room. Over to you, Patrick, to further clarify on what is taking place.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. It's a pleasure to be here and contribute to this event. I think Jean-Christophe explained very well the context in which we are trying to reach a key goal. The key goal is, of course, to have a game-changing step in corporate reporting. If I want to simplify, so far, corporate reporting was a combination of a heavily standardized financial reporting side and a somewhat loose side, including the management report or elsewhere, of sustainability information that were not satisfying, meeting the expectations of users. And the idea is now that corporate reporting should be walking on two legs of equal importance. And financial reporting should have as a counterpart sustainability reporting under the coordination, under the overall umbrella of management report, where the governance and management of the reporting entities would clarify the integration of the two dimensions of sustainable development. So the overemphasis on financial reporting is now replaced by the dual, the two legs on which you want to walk under the coordination of a brain, which is, of course, the governance and the management of the reporting entity. So the goal is clear. It's ambitious because what has been achieved in financial reporting over decades, due to the urgency of putting the emphasis on sustainability, we need to do it in a much shorter period of time. So that's the challenge, if I may say so. What is key is that standards are a pivotal element of the landscape. In the legal framework in the EU, Of course, the legislative level is primary. It is clarifying the concept, the orientations, the decisions, the context in which all of this is going to be developed, and the obligations for the reporting entities and the scope, etc., as Jean-Christophe clearly explained. But, you know, there is no reporting of substance without standards. We see it at financial reporting, and the overall idea is to replicate having the two pillars of proper corporate reporting for sustainability, i.e. high-level principles, but also detailed standards, allowing for comparability and relevance. Now, as Jean-Christophe has explained, standard setting is underway. The project task force, which I have the privilege of sharing, has been active since September last year. It comprises 35 members from 13 member states, from all stakeholder groups, origins that you can consider in the EU for proper representation. And we also have developed on the basis of contributions in kind, from a variety of contributors, and a balanced way. We have organized the secretariat of about 30 full-time equivalent to support the task force. So the task force operated in two phases. The first phase, at the request of the Commission, we performed a preparatory work. Between September 2020 and February 2021. We delivered a substantial report to the Commission, and I think it's fair to say that due to the relationship with the Commission, the proposal, the CSRD that is tabled, is extremely compatible with the recommendation, the 54 recommendations that the project task force made in February. It's no miracle because we had a constant dialogue. Now, since April 21st, when the Commission tabled the CSRD proposal with the legislative process that is moving forward, we've been asked to start elaborating the standard. I should mention that when you want standards, you need a standard setter. So in parallel to what has been done by the project task force, the EFRAG is modifying its governance on the basis of a report which was prepared by its chairman, Jean-Paul Gauzès. And now the modification of the governance of EFRAG to establish a second pillar for sustainability reporting standards is underway. But this will be in place probably at the end of the first quarter of 2022. And there was no possibility to start only on April 1st, 2022. So that's why the Commission suggested that the project task force be reactivated and that we start elaborating with a handover to the bodies when established of the work that will have been carried out. We have a due process which is extremely precise. There is a consultation of the due process, but we have followed already what is under consultation to make sure that we will adjust if need be. But the due process is key because standard setting in the EU is following, fully transparent process. So at this stage, we are working in clusters. I will tell you what we are doing in a minute. We already made publicly available a working paper on the climate standard prototype, which is, in our view, one of the elements. I think that the previous speakers have mentioned the interaction between biodiversity and climate, and in fact with other elements also of environmental subject matters. So it might be of interest for you to have a look at the prototype. Of course, this will change over time because we have future steps to follow in order to get to a final stage. A few words on the architecture. The architecture is combining what we call the three rules of three, if I may say so. The first rule of three is that we feel that we should have a sector agnostic layer of disclosures, cascading down to a sector specific layer of disclosures, and finally being complemented by an entity specific layer, onboarding the specificities of each and every entity following an assessment process, which is the starting point for a responsible capitalism. So that's the first rule of three. The other rule of three is that we promote three reporting areas that follow management, the management systems of businesses. The first one is strategy. The second one is implementation of strategy. So policies and targets, action plans and resources. And finally, of course, performance measurement. How do you position yourself on the direction of travel that you have adopted and that you are trying to put in place? By the way, these three reporting areas compare well with the TCFD 4 pillars, even if we have chosen a slightly different terminology. And the third rule of three is that, as mentioned by Jean-Christophe, we have a comprehensive approach on the subject matters: environmental, social, and governance. Governance, we even call it governance plus, because we are, environment is addressing planet, social is addressing people, and we feel that governance plus should address everything related to the intangible dimension of, the moral person, that, by combining people and planet contributions. In that respect, of course, under environment, we have 6 subtopics: climate change, climate mitigation, climate adaptation, sorry. We have biodiversity, we have water, we have pollution, and we have circular economy. So all of this being, of course, we are trying to coordinate and make sure that there is no gap and no overlap, but on the contrary, a seamless vision of the environmental dimension of sustainable development. As mentioned by Jean-Christophe, we are operating under the double materiality approach. Timeline, crucial. Our intention is to try to get to a pre-exposure draft by the end of the year, with a view to possibly start public consultation in the first quarter of 2022, and with a view to hand over for the final stages of standard setting to the established bodies of EFRAG at the end of the first quarter. It's pretty ambitious, even if we have been able to regroup 35 members plus 30 full-time equivalent of support staff. What will the biodiversity standard look like? It will address, the 3 reporting areas. So, first of all, the strategic dimension with 3 sub-dimensions: business model, so under double materiality, assessment of risks and opportunities and impacts, and also the third element, the focus on the governance of biodiversity. So strategy, then policies and targets, implementation, so policies and targets, action plan and resources. And finally, performance measurement, where we are at the moment analyzing what should be the areas to be covered. Of course, we are confronted with a number of challenges as regards biodiversity. we may be a little optimistic on the timetable, because of course we would like to onboard the everything that is currently underway, and the Kunming COP15 will be extremely interesting. Everything that has been described during this webinar is relevant, and therefore we are considering to have a first batch and then to possibly reanalyze it on the basis of what has been done. Because one of the challenges is that climate is relatively mature in terms of metrics, in terms of disclosures, what is expected from businesses. We cannot exactly say the same on biodiversity. It's still under development, and we certainly do not want to make mistakes or to anticipate what will be developed probably quickly, but over time nevertheless. So one of the challenges is to progress, even if the level of maturity of biodiversity in terms of disclosures. And when I'm talking about disclosure, of course, you can always have narrative disclosures. They are fine, but comparability of narrative disclosures is limited. So, under a machine readable system to start with. So metrics, we are extremely interested by all contributions, and that's a call for contributions in terms of what can be done in terms of metrics in order to feed in our standard setting process. Thank you very much. I've been long-winded, a little too much maybe.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick. This is very clarifying and providing a lot of information to us. I'd like to introduce also Ludmila, who did an inventory on data and the gaps and also maturity. So maybe she can enlighten the challenge a bit. And then we'll go to the Q&A.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you. It is a pleasure to present today investors, to represent their views on what is happening in the biodiversity space today. I will present one small exercise that we actually did as part of working group on impact assessment within Finance and Biodiversity Foundation. We did it together with Alexis Gouin from Federal Finance Gestion, who's present today, and with Adrien Gaudin from Mirova, who is hopefully present today as well. So thank you very much to them both for their contributions. And globally, the whole experiment is in front of your eyes. What we did, we tried to understand the space of biodiversity investors are finding themselves in today. So we try to understand what are the dimensions of biodiversity that investors need to consider while they are trying to put in place their biodiversity policies or strategies or any activity internally. And we identified 3 dimensions globally to keep in mind. The first one, surely the scientific dimension. We need to keep in mind scientific imperatives and align our actions with global scientific goals in terms of preservation, our natural capital, and avoidance of biodiversity loss. The second dimension that we studied as part of this experiment relates to technical constraints. So data and tools availability, metrics availability today. How we can actually, what are the tools that we have today in order to tackle scientific imperatives, in order to respond to the scientific dimension of biodiversity. And we did actually a data and tools inventory as part of this impact assessment working group, and we try to understand how science and technical side of biodiversity are aligned or not, and what are the gaps to bridge in the future. And the third dimension that we studied as part of this experiment is the legal one. So we tried to understand whether the rules, the norms, and the standards being developed today in the situation of quite high uncertainty, let's be frank on that, how they can stimulate the alignment of investment strategies with what can be done on corporate sides in order to respond to scientific imperatives that we are facing today. So you see there a number of standards that we had analyzed as part of this experiment. We did an analysis of CSRD and the European taxonomy, the projects of these standards on the corporate perspective. We also try to understand what has been done as part of TNFD today, even if they are only at the beginning of their journey. We also contacted SBT, SBT for Nature, to understand their approach on biodiversity, etc., etc. So this is this is the package of standards that we have analyzed on the corporate side, and then we looked at what investors have as part of potential stimuli that are created today. And we analyzed SFDR, its relation with the European CSRD and taxonomy, how they're interconnected, whether the incentives are aligned and to what extent, and whether we have some kind of a global ground, common ground, in order to act on biodiversity. This is the first test. So we don't seem to have all answers, and I think it's impossible to have all answers today on the alignment of the technical, scientific, and legal side. But we try to understand what can be done, what questions we as investors should ask ourselves in order to advance on biodiversity. And here are the questions that we actually came up as a result of this experiment. There are 4 of them. You see them there in blue. I came up with a question on the timeline, and this is directly related to what Patrick was saying about the capacities to produce, to report, to produce a disclosure of good quality on biodiversity today. And we understand that the topic is very complex, with a lot of different sub-issues, and it's not an easy task to do. So one of the questions, will investors have relevant reported biodiversity data by the time they need to comply themselves? And we see that SFDR is already pushing investors towards some action, and we try to understand to what extent we can rely on corporate data or on a model data, and whether model data can be a true source of understanding what is happening in terms of biodiversity or not. So this is one of the questions we are asking. The second one relates to biodiversity approach that is considered by this or that standard, soft or hard law, as we didn't really make difference here. How to ensure that we pursue the same science-based biodiversity goals under different rules? And this is the big question of how actually the legal ground of biodiversity space is aligned with the scientific ground of the biodiversity space. And we have noticed that in many cases, we didn't have a lot of problems here because there is some kind of a consensus on the market that IPBES drivers and standards are quite commonly accepted, but we would potentially need a little bit more clarity on how to actually address the drivers that are identified by scientific body. The third question that we have asked as investors, these are quite rhetorical questions. We would need to work on them ourselves, is about the double materiality principle as it is applied to biodiversity, because we do understand it, and it is one of the core principles of sustainability financial regulation in the European Union. We do understand it, but the question is how we apply it to biodiversity. When we're talking about how biodiversity impacts businesses and business models, do we talk about dependencies? Do we talk about risks? If we're talking about risks, should we apply more or less the same framework as it was developed by TCFD? for climate, and this is what Patrick mentioned also, should we align with the principles and should we actually leverage on our knowledge in the climate space, or should we develop something particularly specific for biodiversity? How risks, financial risks and dependencies are interconnected, and should we include opportunities in the space of double materiality or not? So these questions are still to find their place in the regulation, but not only, also probably in the understanding by investors of what biodiversity space actually is. And the last question we're asking is about metrics to use, because we start to have first indications in terms of KPIs that could be potentially required, for instance, by SFDR from investors to report. And we look at these metrics. We also receive some additional incentives and some additional signs from local initiatives, like the initiatives in France, Article 29 or the climate and energy law. And we see that the logic, the Article 29 is talking about footprint. The European SFDR is talking about something quite more located with, with the approach, more geolocation approach. So should we use, how should we actually align and consider all the metrics under different norms, and how to align them actually? Because in many cases, and when we look at the variety of metrics that popping up today in biodiversity space, they can tackle problems which are completely different. How to align them, how to use them at the same time under the same norms and under the same standards, and how to, based on these different KPIs proposed, how to actually align and go towards one and the same goal, well identified. This is a big question. And as I said, this was the first test, so the first round of work that we did as part of Impact Assessment Working Group. We will continue this work to probably discover more, to discover solutions to these questions, or discover new questions to tackle, in order to be sure that investors are aligned with the global imperatives, and we really need to work all together in order to reach one common goal, which is to avoid biodiversity loss. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ludmila. That was a very summarized findings of all the work that you've been doing on this with your working group. Maybe good to add that we're looking into drafting a paper from all this work, so to more easily inform a wider audience. But yeah, as you have noticed, it's also delivering more questions. And I'm also noticing some questions in the chat. So one question I would like to start with for both Jean-Christophe and also Patrick is in what way the science base of information will be used and reflected also in the whole process of getting to new standards. And I'm not sure, Jean-Christophe, whether you have a view on this or whether to hand over to Patrick.
I would think to hand it over to Patrick.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. Oh, you're muted. Please unmute. And then specifically on biodiversity.
Apologies. Yes.
Specifically on biodiversity, of course.
Yes, no, I just wanted to add on double materiality that we are working on conceptual guidelines, how to approach double materiality, which we define as being, impact materiality, the inside out, the impacts of businesses on environment, and outside in, the risks and opportunities of businesses from what's happening outside. So it's difficult because, you know, it's some sort of a religious debate sometimes. And dynamic materiality is, of course, a key point. But dynamic materiality is, sorry to say that, it's obvious. When something becomes so impactful, you have then a rebound effect, but you can have an effect on yourself without having an impact sometimes. So, you know, it is pretty complex. That being said, science-based, in order to approach what is material, I think that science is key. Now, you have two approaches. You have the approach of, you know, consensus. You know, you put 7 experts in a room and you say, what is material for you? And then, and then you have a potential approach. You have the other approach, which is more objective, which is science-based on, for instance, on impact, where you will have the scale of impact, severity. You would have the scope of impact. Is it global? Is it limited in terms of geography? Is it remediable? Is it likely? So you can have, but I have to tell you that there is no miracle solution. So it's a combination of, you know, scientific approaches, which are, you know, developing as we speak, and consensus, perception-driven, you know, input to the standard setting process. I hope that clarifies a little bit the difficulty, but also, you know, at a moment in time, you have to decide. So you take, you know, you balance the two factors and you move forward.
Thank you very much. And if you look into this from the biodiversity angle, is there any content or thoughts you can share on potential content for the standards on biodiversity?
No, as I mentioned, it's under development as we speak. So, you know, and I'm not the leader of the cluster that is developing the standards. So I would prefer to refrain from commenting. You know, what I have seen so far is that we are onboarding, you know, what has been described by Basil in terms of, you know, what is preparatory work for COP15 is, and the agreement is extremely important to us. So I hope, well, it will be refined probably, but following the negotiations, I hope we still remain on the same, because on the same group of, you know, threats and risks, because that's the one we are taking as a basis to start elaborating. I forgot to mention that we will have several sets of standards. One is contemplated for the end of 2022. One is contemplated for the end of 2023. So you have to prioritize also, because, you know, in a game-changing exercise, you have always to reach a quote-unquote compromise between a game-changing step and what is acceptable by businesses in a short time frame. Acceptable and feasible, I would say. It's not acceptability per se, it's feasibility also. Because so, and I personally anticipate that to get to a stable platform comparable to the financial reporting one, in terms of sustainability reporting, we will need more sets than 2. My personal view, but that's a personal view. So the Commission might be in disagreement with me, but I think that we have to contemplate a stable platform, you know, by the end of the decade or so. And that's good, by the way, because even if we succeed only at the end of the decade to have a sustainability reporting, which is the counterpart of financial reporting with the same quality, you know, it would be an extraordinary achievement, because it has taken decades and not one, many decades for financial reporting to get there.
Thank you very much. We're coming to the end of the whole webinar, which was very rich for information, but also shows there are certainly more steps to further develop and co-develop. Anita, you have a few key takeaways as a wrap-up?
Yes, I tried to do my best. We had a lot of information, just a few, we had the first block on policy, biodiversity policy, what's coming up, global biodiversity framework. We heard the chair, co-chair of open-ended working group talk about 4 targets, goal, closing financial gaps. We heard on target 14 to watch, ensuring financial flows are in line with biodiversity, target 15, target 18, 19. Very important. Most important message, January, there will be a following up. Reflections on the draft on the GBF will be continued. We heard WWF, Guido, on we need a Paris-style agreement for nature, high-level political commitment. We have to halve our biodiversity footprint by 2030. And transforming key sectors in the GBF to achieve a nature positive world was his message. And then, of course, the second block on regulation, we heard Jean-Christophe talk about the CSRD and the deadlines. First set of standards ready mid-2022. In 2024, companies have to publish their first reports according to the standards. And that's the financial year of 2023. That's quite soon already. Then we heard Patrick explain also more in depth on under development 6 topics under environment, under the CSRD, climate change, circular economy, climate adaptation, and also the deadlines are end of the year, draft already for a public consultation pretty soon. And the public consultation itself will start in Q1, so that's also soon. And it will address 3 reporting areas for biodiversity, as I understood: strategy, business models, assessment, risk, impact, but also policy and targets. And Ludmila closed the whole regulation story on and did a research within the impact assessing working group of the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation, and research that there are still a lot of questions from the financial institutions that need to be answered, and in which with her group she will investigate how to find the answers. For instance, relevant biodiversity data reported by the time they need to comply. It's a big question on how and what. Is it there on time? But also she will continue this work within the impact assessing working group, and to see how investors can align as much as possible with the coming up regulation. So that's it in a wrap up, 3 minutes.
Thanks a lot, Anita. Quick summary of 1.5 hour rich sharing of information. I think this webinar also contributed to the whole ecosystem on reporting, policy making in the space of finance and biodiversity. And if you like to become a member of the Business and Biodiversity Platform, you can register through the website and stay connected. And we're having a dedicated community as well under the Business and Biodiversity Platform. So we'll stay connected and keep collaborating on the topic. Thanks a lot to all the speakers, and thanks a lot to all the participants also for all the questions and for contributing. We'll follow up with sharing the slides, and we'll make minutes and also the Q&A. Much appreciated. Good evening or good day to the ones in the USA. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.